Today, on episode number 558 of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, How to Learn Students' Names with Michelle Miller.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonnie Stahoviak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to improve our productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. It's with joy that I welcome back to the show Dr. Michelle Miller. She's a cognitive psychologist, researcher, and speaker focused on supporting and inspiring teachers, instructional designers, and leaders who care about learning. She advocates for building learning experiences based on research on how people learn and for using educational technologies in ways that align with those principles of learning. She's the author of several books, including Minds Online, Teaching Effectively with Technology, and Remembering and Forgetting in the Age of Technology, Teaching, Learning, and the Science of Memory in a Wired World. And the book she'll be speaking with us about today is called A Teacher's Guide to Learning Students' Names, Why You Should, Why It's Hard, and How You Can. Dr. Miller completed her PhD in cognitive psychology and behavioral neuroscience at the University of California, Los Angeles, and currently serves as a professor of psychological sciences and President's Distinguished Teaching Fellow at Northern Arizona University. Michelle Miller, welcome back to Teaching in Higher Ed.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
So great to be able to see you today and spend some time with you. I understand you have been doing even more writing. We're here to talk about one of your books, but even more writing. And just as we're bringing ourselves into the conversation, would love to hear any advice for those of us who yearn to create, yearn to write, and maybe how to keep our minds sharp for doing such things.
Let's see. I think, yes, with the writing practice, I've really come to settle on a sort of a philosophy, and this is just really from the past year when I was working on another, really my longest, heftiest book manuscript to date, and we'll kind of see where that goes in the future. But I really hit on this insight that at least worked for me, which is to really focus on the practice. And it's funny, I'm also an avid crafter. I knit and crochet and things like that outside of my sort of professional life. And we talk about in crafting being a process knitter or a product knitter. There are people who are so process oriented that they will knit some complex thing and they'll unravel it. They'll say like, "Oh, that was nice, but I think I'll use this yarn for something else." Actually in knitting, I am a product knitter. I fall in love with the finished product, and that's what I'm going for. But that really does, I flipped that around very deliberately, really in the past year, as I mentioned, for my writing practice. And I said, you know what? The end product, that's great if I get this wonderful book that I want to read and hopefully others will want to read at the end, or article or Substack post or thing like that. But the the project powers the process. Project powers the process is what I came up with, is like the purpose of having, for me, Substack or things that people are interested in reading, or a big goal like a book length manuscript, is to get me writing on a regular basis, not the other way around. And I feel like this is probably going to either, other people will either also seize on this and go, yes, that's great. And it's a way to take away a little bit of the anxiety and they like, oh no, I must be perfect, part of it. And other people will look at this and say, no, that's terrible. I don't want to do that. But that's kind of where I've been in the past year. So that's sort of the philosophical angle on it. I do borrow lots of things from psychology to get myself over that sort of blank page. How do I get started? Stuff and get momentum. There are cues or certain musical pieces, a couple of musical pieces and playlists that I only use when I'm sitting down to write. I don't listen to them any other time. I really I get a little too obsessed with word count, and I have this spreadsheet that calculates that each day. So I kind of keep my eyes on those metrics. And yeah, I think as far as cueing and getting that sort of Pavlovian learning going, I also kind of I feel like you can either condition yourself to write in the specific time and place every day, or you kind of take it in the other directions, which is what I did, is really trying to deliberately train myself to be able to write pretty much anytime, anywhere. And that's really what has carried me through. So I don't know, stay tuned for more and to see what the end product of all those new processes are.
I'm going to see if I can find this link. I'm fairly sure that I will, but of course, now that I say that, I probably won't. But James Lang had a wonderful piece about his practice, and he was talking about some of those cues. I don't remember if he actually referred to them as cues, but I recall being surprised and delighted by him mentioning that he lights a candle each time he goes
Ah,
to write. And I thought that was so beautiful. And you and I actually crossed paths, but it was a year apart, I think, or something like that. I know you spent some
hmm
time at Louisiana State University at a couple of their
uh-huh.
campuses. And then I just traveled there about a year after you did. And it was so fun to sort of feel
hmm
in some ways like we were continuing conversations together. It was so delightful. But a woman that I met there shared, she actually asked if she could take a card, a scorecard for the Go Somewhere card game that I've developed. I always joke and say I developed it with the help of the internet because I got such great advice and resources from a LinkedIn post that I did. But anyway, she wanted to know if she could have the card. And I thought, well, I mean, I was kind of curious. I was just, I had all these thoughts flooding through my head of why would somebody possibly want their scorecard? And the thing that didn't ever come up in my mind is a thing called junk journaling. And she said, oh, you got to look it up. It's being talked about a lot across social media. So go check it out. And boy, did her promise ever deliver. Junk journaling is like for those who might be intrigued by scrapbooking, but it feels too precious to you and that you have to be too perfect for it. And as you were describing your writing process, I was thinking about I haven't actually, as of this recording, I haven't done my first junk journaling adventure yet, but I've started to put aside the tools that I might want to use and looked at, I'm starting to watch some videos and what kind of process would I like to take and what tools would I need. And I just think whether it's writing, creating, knitting, if we just have a home for those things that are important to us as we go through our process, it just makes it so much easier, whether it's because it's a cue, lighting the candle, or just because if you're a little bit more scattered, like I can sometimes be in my own mind, just, oh, these are the tools that you might need to do this thing that you do. I just find that an intriguing idea and looking forward to getting into junk journaling. I had also, speaking of social media, a delightful exchange where people also talked about this somehow links in with what are called traveler's journals and the idea of
Mm.
documenting that. And I think, I mean, I don't do a lot of traveling, so it's kind of fun to just think about our lives as a metaphor of traveling and some of the things that might be helpful to gather. So I saved they had made me a name badge as the keynote speaker. So I saved that little laminated thing where otherwise I might have felt like it was going to go into a landfill somewhere. I thought, well, that's a perfect thing to junk journal. I got lots of great stickers from some of their programs there at LSU. It was really delightful. So, well, we're
Mm.
here today, I'm sure, to talk about a lot of things, but I just want to share that a lot of our focus is going to be on something that can be so challenging for many of us, and that has to do with learning students' names. So, we're going to talk a bit now about your book, A Teacher's Guide to Learning Student Names, why you should, why it's hard, how you can. And I found it such a delightful read. I again felt like we were having a conversation the whole way through. An important aspect of learning names is just our mindset, Michelle. What can you tell us about the importance of thinking about? I mean, speaking of processes, why is it important to think about mindset before we even start to just try to learn really anything?
Oh my gosh. Well, and you know what? It connects back to one of the things that made me fall in love with cognitive psychology and scientific psychology back when I was, man, I think about it now, I was literally a teenager. So that's a long time, which is just this very, very elementary. But I think profound question of how on the inside in our mental landscapes and machinery, how are we essentially the same and how are we fundamentally, yeah, what are some ways that we are different? And this is one of those like we are probably more similar than most of us realize. When it comes to learning names, I think a lot of us kind of simmer in this little personal, sometimes sort of self-flagellating mindset of, everybody else can do this and I can't. And that is part of what brought me to psychology too, of some of my own quirks and going, wow, do other people experience this? And how can I make sense of some of the different ways that I clearly think about and process the world? So coming to names, that is probably one of the clearest where I mean, time and again, as a psychologist, I mean, I do have to laugh. I mean, people say weird stuff to us they ask us some interesting questions when you say I'm a psychologist. It comes with the territory, but definitely one of them is this revelation. People say, I'm really not good at learning names. And this is the thing. This is one of these rare areas, as I share in the book, that we have a pretty strong degree of consensus and shared understanding of how this one thing in memory and learning actually works. And so the story is generally like, wow, it's kind of a miracle that any of us ever correctly learn a name, let alone that we make mistakes sometimes. So that is the first part of the mindset question, which we ended up building right into the title as I worked through this with the publishers and editors, which is this is hard. It's hard for most people. And so having that expectation changes things. And I don't think it has to be this fatalistic thing of like, what a chore this is going to be. But you can expect to put in effort. But I also try to balance that with, and if you put in effort in the right ways, you can see it not become easy or magically just happen at will, but you can really, really see an improvement in this one thing. And I mean, I think we can all use that. It's a win that we can put up on the board. And what's fun about writing for academic audiences too is you can actually dig into the like, well, why? What's the basis for changing your mindset in this way? It's not just kind of happy talk of like, well, it's hard, try harder, you'll do better. But what are some of the processes and kind of hopefully drawing in the reader's curiosity about, well, why is this one thing so hard? We all do it all the time, or we try. What are some of the processes that go on underneath? And once you understand that as well, I mean, of course, I give my own advice about how to go about it, but once you have that understanding and that mindset and that openness, well, you can probably come up with techniques that are even better and are geared to your own individual strengths, capabilities, and characteristics.
Yes, and I think I'm hearing you say that just how important it is to recognize that it's difficult for all of us, and we maybe
Mhm.
all is too strong of a word. Most of
Mm.
us, a
Most of
common
us.
a common human feature might be the challenge that it is. I think that we need to now shift our attention into why, though. If something's difficult, often things that are difficult, you started talking about writing. Writing can be so difficult for so many of us. Then why do it? Why should we spend the time and effort and really carve that out to learn names?
Right. And so I think that this is, and how I, together with some input from my editors and my readers, uh, framed this in the book this is an inclusive teaching issue. It really is. And especially as we discuss in the book, this is a really uncomfortable thing, but I just decided to wade into it, especially among students for marginalized identities. They've had probably some bad experiences here. And so there's not a blank slate necessarily for our students, especially if they've had, more egregious examples of teachers saying, "Oh, I'm not going to try to learn your name," or something is, I perceive your name as unusual," or something like that. So there is that side of it. But really, even in any interpersonal or professional context, being able to have a person's name down, as many folks have observed, even the famed Dale Carnegie, who I think we've all heard his little saying about, oh, it's the sweetest sound and that anybody ever hears as their own name. I don't, I mean, don't take that as literal fact, but going back a long ways, people saying it elevates the conversation differently to be able to use names. And then having the practice, not just knowing them and keeping that knowledge to yourself, but actually flowing that into our discussions and really making the discussions interactive and fully two-way in our classrooms, whether they're small or large. The intro to the book really talks about how this is one of my key failures very early on in my very first class, where I'm thinking, wow, I nailed it. Why? Because I was so prepared and I had my stacks of handouts and, I stood and used the correct terminology. It was basically taking the whole scenario of a conference presentation. That was my model, where it's all about me and the information that I'm going to share with you. And when what I needed to be doing was connecting with students and finding out what they actually needed in this breakout section I was teaching, as if it was this giant lecture stage, and go there. And the names were a part of that. So I think it's also part of that, another mindset shift of, hey, instead of I'm sharing information with some faceless group, to we are actually in conversation in this classroom. And I guess last of all, something that I incorporated into the book is what can it actually look like when we are even in a large setting conducting a back and forth, a discussion, to be able to say, and we're going to be responding to Michael's point here. And Jessica, you wanted to respond to what David said, and so on. And I have actually a video clip that I just pulled off the net, but it's one of my favorites. I show it in some of my teaching practicum courses, of a very large, it's a legal philosophy class, and he leads this crackling discussion, and he just on the fly just asks people their names and builds up the richness of the discussion in that way. So there are a myriad of reasons, whether you come at it from inclusion, whether you come at it from, I want to really level up the warmth and the interactivity of my teaching, to I just want to have a really great discussion that we all leave and we feel like that was something special.
I'm curious now. You have my interest peaked. Does it happen to be a clip from Michael Sandel?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. I believe that's one of the Harvard great lectures. And
Yeah.
I've shown this clip for a while. It was suggested to me as part of a different development exercise, and then I adapted it and I show it as an example of, like, okay, this is a classic lecture, and there's a lot of debate about there about the value of the classic lecture, but it is highly interactive, and so I do show it as a model just in and of itself, to say, well, what do you notice about the techniques that this lecturer is using? But then I kind of had that aha moment and I said, oh my gosh. And it relates to this topic as well, because that's one of the incredibly striking things. Now, I don't know Michael Sandel, and I don't know what techniques he's using sort of behind the scenes to be able to do that as well as he does. But clearly it's something that I feel like he must be very deliberately doing that as part of this lecture.
I think it's such a remarkable example across so many fronts. I use it not for that purpose, but for different purposes in a class that I
Hmm.
teach. But and I'll put a link to the lectures
Mm,
in the show notes in case anybody would like to watch. I mean, just it's wonderful topics as well that he covers. He almost shrinks down that room. I believe it
hmm.
holds more than 500 people if memory serves, certainly hundreds and hundreds of people. And he certainly doesn't call on all of them by name, but it feels so personal. I've had students
Mhm.
tell me that as they are watching it, they feel like they are there in that large Harvard lecture. And I've had many of them tell me that it's almost, not just almost, they've told me that it's boosted their confidence. They saw such a separation between anybody who would be able to go to such a prestigious school. And they can picture themselves, they do picture themselves being in that room. So you mentioned this being an inclusive practice, and now I'm my mind is swimming with We had so many conversations about trust, educational trust at the recent pod
Mm.
conference, which Michelle and I got to share a ride back to the airport together. So we've
Yeah.
got to have some off-air time in the recent months. But in those conversations, we kept talking about secondhand trust. And now as you're sharing, Michelle, I'm thinking about the secondhand benefits. Maybe if I don't have everyone's name memorized in that large lecture hall, for example, but the fact that I engage so intimately and conversationally with a few, can that feeling of inclusiveness spread to others in the room the similar way that secondhand trust can as well? It's very intriguing.
Mm.
I don't know if anything's coming to mind for you in that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I guess a couple of things. I mean, I lean pretty heavily on, I mean, there's not a huge amount of research in this very specific area, and I was a little surprised when I waded into it, and that research is probably still developing, and I'm sure I didn't find everything that's out there, but I do lean pretty heavily on some really well put together research that looks very specifically at learning proportions of names in large, I think in this case it was a STEM class, not exclusively the large classes that you'd find on any universe, but typically it's social sciences and STEM. That's where students show up and look around and go, oh, wow, I feel very anonymous in this big room. And where teachers are always, really engaged teachers are always saying, how can I do what you're talking about, shrinking the room? And there's some evidence that absolutely, as your intuitions might suggest, that if you learn a proportion of names in a large class, yes, 100, maybe it's not realistic to memorize everybody, but if you get a proportion, that creates an outsized impression of knowing names. Now, in the book, I would say, well, you want to be self-aware of like, okay, if you're going to get a proportion, that proportion is probably going to be selective, and what are whose names are getting learned here. I like to, my little heuristic is there's always students who stop up at the front with lots of different classes, but especially like an intro class to say, I have to share this example, or I didn't want to raise my hand, and here's the thing, or they just want to chat. And if you're one of those students, I'm going to know your name by the first couple of times. So that's sort of my goal there. But if you just know a few, my goodness, students may assume that you know far more of them. So there's absolutely that question.
Another aspect of the reading for me went really personal, Michelle, and that has to do with aging and memory.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, as it should be, very nuanced. Yes, our brain changes as we age. What
Yeah.
specifically having to do with learning names might we want to be aware of? And could you also just sneak in there some hope as it relates to memory and learning as we age?
Right. And here too, I mean, this whole book, a little bit of the backstory of the book and the context is, I, I mean, I got to approach this in a real spirit of fun and nostalgia and reflection because I reached all the way back to some of my roots and the research that I was publishing at the very beginning of my career. And some of that research, besides being very much in the area of language and memory and psycholinguistics, was cognitive aging. So my graduate advisor, we had this big vibrant lab and we had a grant from the National Institutes of Aging. So we did a lot of basic research questions, but we also looked very specifically at what can be very practical questions. So that's something that I've just dipped back into throughout the years because it is such an important one. And in this book, we said, okay, let's also consider this from a variety of different angles and different characteristics. And one of them was definitely aging. Now, also important because demographically, we professors, for which is the audience for this book, we do skew a little bit on the upper end, don't we? So quite naturally, we want to know about this. So with respect to names, yeah, it's sort of bad news, good news here. Absolutely. If you have the impression that names become more of a struggle, as you get older, that you're nothing is out of the ordinary about that. And especially when we're talking about retrieving names that we haven't used for a long time. And if you kind of think about it sort of almost in mathematical terms, the older I get, the further back I'm sometimes reaching for a name. I mean, if I'm talking about, say, my fourth grade teacher and what was her name, I mean, that's very different if I'm 30 than if I'm, say, 55. So that is kind of normal. It doesn't make it any more fun, but it should be a little less anxiety provoking. Also, encoding new names, a process which is the basis for being able to successfully retrieve it later. I talk a lot about that in the book and the factors that go into successfully encoding or putting it into memory. Encoding all kinds of new information does seem to take a bit longer with age. So there too, it's almost a little bit of a mathematical function. Now, the good news is that we can put to bed as really a cultural myth the idea that everything in your mind and brain, your whole memory is just progressively more shot every year you're on Earth. This is not the case. Other aspects of memory hold up really, really well over time. And there's also some systematic and some classic studies, including one that was actually done on college professors in their 60s and 70s, I believe, and looking at how some encoding new information quickly was still a struggle, but boy, they were still absolutely, they excelled at more meaningful information. So, more broadly, giving oneself more time, realizing that especially when we're doing something that's brand new and fast paced, that that's going to be more challenging, but that doesn't mean that memory is going across the board. That can, I think, be very reassuring. And also we've also there's also some fun stuff like those difficulties we have with retrieving names sometimes where they get caught on the tip of the tongue. Um, that's actually what it's called in the scientific literature, the tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's annoying as it can be, but it doesn't mean that that information is gone permanently. And it also tends to be even more common among people who speak multiple languages and have larger vocabulary. So if you think you're kind of selecting from a bigger bucket of all the words and names you know, that sort of makes sense. But yeah, whenever I'm hitting that, I go, well, okay, it's just partly it's a glitch that I don't like, but it's partly perhaps reflecting that I have acquired so many words over the course of my lifetime. So hopefully that can give a flavor of how I come at the age issue and how we can give ourselves some grace and but still go into this with some optimism.
My hope in having you here today is that people will pick up this book. It is not any substantial length that should prohibit any of us from
Mhm.
saying, I don't have enough time to read it. It's definitely a doable read and an important one. So I'm going to ask you an entirely unfair question because you already have
Okay.
mentioned that there are multiple methods that we could use,
Mhm.
and it's going to depend a little bit on our strengths. But let's just start with one technique that might work
Mhm.
well for the vast majority of us. And I'm going to say what it's not, and then maybe you could share what it is. So, from what I've learned from Michelle's and other people's research is what's not going to help me as much is just repeating it. I mean, that might be an aspect, but maybe not the biggest fulcrum to help me be able to have that neural network that I need. So if it's not just repeating or studying my notes, if you will, just reviewing the information, if that's not going to be the
Mhm.
greatest contributor to learning names, what would be another approach that might be a little bit better of a fulcrum to get those things
Yeah.
cemented?
Yeah, and it strikes me, I mean, the way you're talking about it here too, it's another thing that I definitely hope this sparks for folks who are newer to some of the applied memory science. If this can be an entree into, oh, what springboard other ways to encode and learn information that we want to know and learn that quickly and with a side order of fun, as I always like to say. But with names in particular, yeah, when I think about the repetition issue, I think of how I know before I got better at deliberately addressing this issue, how we might go about it. So either in conversation, we hear the name. And we think, oh, okay. And it sort of washes over as passively, or they've got the name tag. How many times have we talk to somebody at the conference and they've got the name tag and we look at the name tag and we look at the name tag and we think, wow, I must know the name. And you know perfectly well, if they covered that name tag up with their hand, you wouldn't have any clue because what have you not done? So these two critical first steps, which again map onto a lot of other learning tasks, are attending and doing some retrieval practice. So, and that attention step, my goodness, that is a huge piece of the battle. And I think this is particularly true with names because especially for those of us who have a little bit of social anxiety, which is me and probably a lot of your listeners, a lot of other things are kind of cascading through our minds when we're talking to somebody new or we're in a social situation and here's 10 people and now I have to introduce myself. And all that drains off attentional resources. And of course, if you aren't really focused when the person says their name, if you don't really focus on that name tag, you're kind of dead in the water at that point. You can back up and start over, but that's about it. But then the retrieval practice, which is, I think, a little bit different, right? Than just saying, like, oh, yeah, I think I heard the name. If you said it back to them right now, could you get that? And for obscure psycholinguistic reasons, actually saying it, like practicing what we call the output phonology, is different and it's critical than just hearing it because the test, as we like to say, the test isn't on how well you can recognize the name. The test is on how well you can say the name. So that's what you need to practice doing. And that I think also blends in for those of us too who need a few little social crutches, actually doing a little bit of retrieval practice where I, without looking at your name tag, try to use your name. That not only is the very best thing I can do for memory, it also gives me that one moment to say, did I mispronounce it? Which is a whole different thing than when I've, say, been working with this person for 3 months or they've been in my class and it's the last week and maybe I never did get the pronunciation down correctly. Better to go ahead and get that part out of the way. So if you have it wrong, either in pronunciation or you have the whole thing wrong, lock, stock, and barrel, they can correct you right then and there. So those two initial steps of I call it attend and say and then retrieve. Those initial steps will take you so far in grappling with the difficulty of learning names.
The nuance that you just presented to us in that tail end, I wanted to just stress it once again. What is the purpose of why we're trying to learn the names? You also were talking about having some struggles with feeling anxious in social situations and then the difficulty so many of us could relate to just being able to attend. I mentioned that you and I both spoke at LSU across, a year. We sort of followed, I guess I was following in your footsteps in that particular linear progression. And I mentioned the woman coming up and talking to me about the junk journal, which I was instantly very intrigued by as she described it to me. In that moment, I was getting a notification on my watch that my flight had been delayed. And so I just know that I'm not able to attend as much as I would really like to because I had thought we were going to need to leave the lunch 20 minutes early and rush to the airport. And my brain's not able to be 100% processing. We're cleaning up all the materials. I thought we were getting ready to strap into the car seatbelts and push off to the airport. And so I just knew I was not fully there. I so wanted to treasure this moment. So I said, would you mind if I took a picture of us together? And then could I take a picture of your name badge? She didn't seem like this would be she didn't seem like this would bother her. And I hoped I left enough space for her to do that. Oh, she seemed very delighted, to be able to do that. And that to me, I think about how many people because I also feel that social anxiety, how many people will come up to me, maybe they'll say something about, somebody told me at the pod conference, we started our podcast and it was because of your podcast. And I thought, that is something I want to remember. And there were so many people who were coming up, some of whom I had met many years ago, some of whom I was meeting for the first time. And I thought, what is it you want to do here? Do you want to memorize this man's name? No, probably not, candidly. In that particular moment, I want to take that feedback and I want to save that encouragement up for weeks when I'm having a really rough time. I want that to go in my encouragement folder. So in that case, when we are encountering situations like that, we want to think about what is our objective. And if my objective is just to save that information, if you will, that my brain's not going to be the best for that particular tool. I have this app called Drafts, and that's kind of my chicken scratch. That's where scraps of virtual paper go. This is, I met someone, they mentioned this about the podcast, or they mentioned this about that, and I don't have to retain that in that moment. I can use the digital or the analog tools for what they're really good at, and then just free my brain up. As you were describing these two steps, when I decide, is this something I'm going to try to retrieve and really learn in this moment? Or could I better attend to this moment as it emerges if I just could I take a picture of your name badge, or could I jot down your name real quick? And then, because if I'm not really in that particular moment needing to also put the added pressure of learning a person's name who candidly I may actually never see again for the rest of my life. Like, it may have just been that moment I could attend
Yeah.
to better if I give myself permission to sort of sort these things. This is something I should be learning in the
Mm.
moment, or something I'd like to contribute to in this particular case, like edifying words that people have gifted me with over these years.
Oh gosh, I mean, there's so much nuance in what you're saying as well. I mean, what strikes me is you're kind of talking about cognitive offloading, right? This phenomenon, which I mean, the term itself is so evocative, where we say, okay, yeah, my brain, human brains are not good at say memorizing when you're the exact moment your plane is supposed to go off, and keeping a time. Our brains do not have really good timers in the head. So your watch is great at remembering that and then reminding you at the appropriate time that here's something that's coming up, and that's cognitive offloading. And that's something that I actually talked about a lot in my previous book on remembering and forgetting the age of technology. And I'm starting to see the cognitive offloading concept be talked about more, and I think it's great. It's a very powerful concept, and it explains some ins and outs of how our memories and attention also interact with technology. However, I've seen a little bit of a trend of something that always kind of gets to me a little bit, which is not in what you said, but just in sort of the social discussion of this as that concept starts to make its way into the culture, is that, oh, that's bad. Offloading is always bad. And it's not. I mean, if I'm offloading, like, well, I can always look up a student's picture on my phone and know that if I'm offloading it in that way, then yeah, that gets in the way of me actually knowing the names and being able to use them fluidly in class. So that is a negative. But offloading your flight information so that you don't have to monitor that while you're in conversation with these folks who are so engaged, that's a good thing. And so there is that nuance, but I think what helps us sort it all out is your intentionality, right? And isn't that what we're oftentimes trying to exhort our students to do? Of like, well, if you really want to remember these things that you need for your exam, instead of just like paging through the book over and over and over and hoping that it's getting in there, here's how you need to kind of break down that information and come at it more systematically using these powerful techniques. You decide, what is it that you want to attend to in this whole textbook. You're not going to remember the whole thing, nor should you, but here's how you can get at what you actually need. And wouldn't it be cool if we faculty and really all of us functioning adults could start to be as planful, to do what you did, to say, here's something that I want to remember, and it starts with attention, like with everything else. We go, what's happening right now could be really useful to me in the future, and this is one of those moments that I want to weave into my big autobiographical life's highlight reel. So, if you want to do that, how do you do it? You're present. You reflect on it. Maybe if I did take the picture, not only does that save the picture, it sort of offloads a little bit in the moment, but what if I went back and reviewed that? Some people now have end of year photo roll reviews, which can serve to help deliberately shape what we remember rather than kind of leaving it up to random chance.
Oh, that's such a great thing there. I was thinking about even that I use an iPhone, and they recently separated out. You can just view your photos and it'll automatically take screenshots out of it. I take a lot of screenshots every single day. And I
Yeah.
like that it sorts it that way in a smart way. Cause I used to feel like, oh, I should be very diligent about every single month going back and deleting those things that aren't more photographic in nature. And now I can still enjoy looking at them and scrolling through them, and it'll automatically sort. So I'm not as particular about making sure I go back and review that. Well, this is the time in the show where we each get to share our recommendations. And I feel that your last two pieces of advice, the attending and the retrieval practice, are going to work really, really well for me here. As we are in the newish year, this is going to air a little bit more into the year than our conversation, but I'm doing a lot of thinking about what would I like to attend to. And I looked back at the end of 2024, they have all these normal things where you can see your top music that you listen to and your top podcasts that you listen to and your top everything you could possibly want. It seems like everyone had their top lists. And I felt a little bit guilty about that. I sometimes describe this as candy, as in not nourishing, that perhaps
Yeah.
I was allowing myself to be attending to things that won't be as nourishing for the long run, to be reacting more to what's happening in a given moment on a given
Yeah.
day. And but I also don't want to think in dichotomous terms, because I do want to be a person who looks at the news, is aware of what is happening in the world. I don't want to give that up. So I've been experimenting a little bit with what I attend to. And I started with on Blue Sky, the social network Blue Sky. I just asked, hey, I've been really enjoying listening to a couple audiobooks, but I'm fairly new to this world. Does anybody have any recommendations of books that would be humorous in nature? Because I thought I'd like to laugh a little more and attend to that. But then I stopped myself and said, actually, just really any good audiobooks would do. So I got a really eclectic mix, some funny books and some that were more serious. But I've just been separating out a little bit more. In a morning where I might have listened to podcasts for an hour, maybe I spend half of that time with an audiobook and half of that time keeping current on current events, and not that I'm militant about it, but just thinking a little bit more, kind of asking the question as I pick up the phone, which is where I listen to these things, what would be more nourishing to me? Getting a longer view of history, overarching view of what's happened in the world, of what's happened in our country specifically, and that kind of thing. So to that end, I have two recommendations, really. One is just audiobooks in general. I have many, many recommendations to come because I've been listening to quite a few of them. So just wait. If you like audiobooks, I will have even more to share with you as I listen to some of the suggestions that came in and also ones that I'm finding on my own. I think audiobooks are it's just so cool. It's almost an art form in and of itself that I've really been enjoying quite a bit. And then specifically, I wanted to recommend a book which has actually been recommended a few times, at least on this podcast over the years. And it's called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. And I believe one of the people who recommended it among many is Kevin Gannon, and he writes about it in his book about hope as well. And I can see why Kevin Gannon and so many others enjoy Rebecca Solnit's work and find it nourishing. And it's just something that I'm enjoying attending to. And again, she's a historian, among other things. And so I'm learning more about the history. And it's just been really nourishing. So I want us to attend to audiobooks as a possible different medium than maybe you're accustomed to attending to, and specifically the audiobook Hope in the Dark. And Michelle, I want to pass it over to you for whatever you'd like to recommend.
Oh, and yeah, and just to respond a little bit to what you said,
Yeah.
I love how you're also kind of framing this as what's nourishing. I mean, folks who've kind of followed me for a while and writing about technology and the mind know that I'm not always a fan of the like those all or nothing rules. Your phone has to be X number of feet away from your bed. You can't have screens. You got to really look at the situation, and I find very few of those hard and fast rules. Either are totally grounded in the brain research that they're oftentimes touted as, or really apply everywhere, every place. But what really does work is to take the honest view of, yeah, what is nourishing, what makes if I feel like listening to podcasts in the morning stresses me out and it takes away some time for this other thing which I really like, well, then by all means, we should act on that and do so deliberately. And it's funny because the names book is actually the first one that where we have an audiobook version, and it's wonderful. I don't read it, but she did a great job. So people can actually, as you said, it's a short book, so a great way to dip a toe in this type of book.
I didn't
And
know
here's another. This
that.
blows my mind because we did not coordinate about this. I wanted to know that this was not scripted, but my recommendation actually has to do with news and news consumption.
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, part of my deep background as a person is very influenced by my late father and his work. He was a career journalist through and through. So I grew up pretty literally running around a newsroom, and so news is very valuable to me. But I agree. It has become very, very difficult to consume it in a way that it really works for us and does what it's supposed to do, informs us and sparks deeper conversation and doesn't just make us anxious and overwhelmed and clicking on everything in sight. And so my recommendation is I'd say this with some trepidation because they're brand new. This is still very much in rollout and pilot phase, but I've been talking to these folks on and off for close to a year. I'm not formally affiliated with them in any way, but I just saw this new application called newsreel.co. So it's an app called Newsreel. And they are looking to create something that, if you really, a very, very broad description of it is a little bit like Duolingo for news, I think is how they sometimes call it. But they are also piloting this as we speak at some different universities around the country to provide students with a subscription to this service, which they say builds a habit of engaging with the news on a day in a daily way and in a planful, organized way, but not just being on it all day long. So kind of if you want to use it that way, you can use it as a one and done. I got myself informed for the day. And so they're putting it out to students. They're working with some professors and other instructors to see how it could be maybe even incorporated into different kind of courses and so on. So I would say they are one to watch. I've just been really pleased to see that application developing, and I think it's high time.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, listeners may not realize that most of the time I have no idea what the guest is going to recommend, and likewise they don't know what I'm going to recommend. But it is pretty wild, Michelle, how often there's crossover. That is pretty wild. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And for those who want to know, I for the first time ever, I will share like when I talk about the Pavlovian music that I use to either get into a writing mode or a working mode. My writing music is the Essential Philip Glass. So it starts with the facades piece that probably a lot of people will recognize. And boy, my brain just seizes on that. And just to get myself energized is a delightful album called Goat Rodeo, which is a sort of a classical fusion. And it's not, again, not something I listen to unless I'm sitting down to work, but it gets me so energized. So folks may want to give those a listen if they want to have a have a little mirror image session of their own and explore how that might help fuel their own practices and mindset as well.
I geek out a lot on some techie people will share what's on their home screens or how they've set up the different things. I'm sure this exists because I don't think I really have that many unique ideas, but it'd be so fun just to see what people's cues are for their writing. I mentioned the piece that I hope I can find from James Lang about his, and then hearing you, I'm just picturing you listening to this music and what it does to your mind and equipping and preparing you for the work to come. That's really fun. I can't wait to listen and go check them out. I'm not familiar with either one. Yeah, so fun. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for coming back on Teaching in Higher Ed. It's been a while, but you've been on the podcast many times, and I'm so grateful that our paths continue to pass and looking forward to reading the new book when it comes out.
Oh, thank you so much. Always great to be here.
Thanks once again to Michelle Miller for joining me for Teaching in Higher Ed. Today's episode was produced by me, Bonnie Stahoviak. It was edited by the ever-talented Andrew Kroger. Podcast production support was provided by the amazing Sierra Priest. Thanks to each of you for listening to the podcast. And if you would like to extend these conversations, I encourage you to sign up for the weekly email. That update can be subscribed to at teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. You'll get the most recent episodes, show notes, as well as some other goodies that don't show up in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time on Teaching in Higher Ed.